If you really want to live to 100, you need, in the United States, for example, there are neighborhoods where the life expectancy is up to 13 years higher.
Could you just start by explaining what a blue zone is?
We found 5 places where people are living statistically longest.
Did you find anything that actually ties these places together?
People in blue zones don't.
Well, Dan's exactly right.
That is very surprising to hear.
We think it's so hard for middle-aged people, but I argue the number one thing you could do to add years to your life is...
Welcome to Zoe, Science and Nutrition, where world-leading scientists explain how their research can improve your health. I'm your host, Jonathan Wolf, founder and CEO of Zoe. Today, we uncover the secrets of the so-called blue zones, the places where celebrating your 100th birthday is commonplace. Our guest is Dan Buettner. He's an explorer, a National Geographic fellow, and a leading blue zones researcher. Dan takes us into the fascinating lives of people who have lived to be 100 in these places, revealing their daily practices and habits. I'm also joined by Professor Tim Spector. He's one of the world's top 100 most cited scientists and Zoe's scientific co-founder. He shares what the science says about why these habits can help us live longer. Today's lessons come from centuries of collective understanding. And in this episode, you'll learn to apply them to live a longer and healthier life. Dan and Tim, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Good to be here.
Brilliant. Well, look, we have this tradition here, Dan, that we always start with a quick fire round of questions. And we have this very strict rule. You can say yes or no, or if you absolutely have to, you can give us a one-sentence answer. Are you up for that?
I'm in.
Good. And Dan is a little jet lagged this morning, so it's a particularly mean way to kid it straight at the beginning, but we're going to give it a go. All right, starting with Dan. Have you found the secret to longevity?
Yes.
Do people in the blue zones all eat the same food?
No.
Could having the right friends help me to live longer?
Yes.
Will you tell us today how we can build our own blue zones at home?
Yes.
Oh, that was easy. And Tim, just a couple for you. Are there foods that can increase my lifespan?
Yes.
Do I have to go to the gym if I want to live a long and healthy life?
No, thank God.
Brilliant. And then final question, Dan, before we get into it. You can have a whole sentence or two. What's the biggest myth about living a long and healthy life that you often hear?
That there's a pill or a supplement or a superfood that's going to be your panacea.
I think that's a brilliant place to start. Well, look, Dan, for anyone who hasn't seen your recent Netflix series or read your book, I strongly recommend it. But let's assume that maybe some of the listeners here haven't done so. And so before we start to really dissect this whole idea about blue zones, could you just start by explaining what a blue zone is and why it caught your interest, now many years ago?
It's both a concept and a place. So I'm a lifelong explorer for National Geographic. I've led about 21 scientific expeditions, but around about 20 years ago, I started looking into this idea of longevity, mainly as a mystery. Okinawa, Japan was producing the longest lived humans in the history of the world, largely free of disability. And I thought, aha, that's a great mystery. And did a facile expedition there, but I got to thinking that perhaps I could, in a sense, reverse engineer longevity. So instead of looking for an answer in a test tube or a petri dish or in some genetic code, find populations where people are living statistically longest, and then look for the correlates or the common denominators to see if the patterns just repeated themselves enough that you could see a signal or draw some conclusions. And we found 5 places where people are living statistically longest. Longest lived men in the world are Sardinia, Italy. Longest lived women, Okinawa, Japan. The island of Icaria, Greece, you have a population living about 8 years longer, but with almost no discernible dementia. In the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, people enjoy about half the rate of middle-age mortality. And what that means is they're about 3 times more likely to reach a healthy age 95. And then in the United States, we found the longest lived people among Christians, Seventh-day Adventists living in and around Loma Linda, California. And then the second part of my work was using standardized methodologies to find the common denominators, and thus my books and the Netflix documentary.
Did you find anything that actually ties these places together?
Well, geographically, they're all in about the 20th parallel north, interestingly. So you don't see people way in the north living a long time, and you don't see people along the equator living a long time. And the reason I think is the 20th parallel is a sweet spot of sorts, is along the equator, people are dying of infectious diseases that hobble their longevity or life expectancy. And in the north, perhaps they spend too much time indoors and eating canned foods and not minding their garden, et cetera. I don't know, but there seems to
I'm
be
feeling doomed already. So we're recording this today in London.
Too far north.
And it's pretty grey and wintry. And I thought you were going to say they don't get enough sunlight. I'm like,
and
so
not
the
a
first
lot of
thing I need to
gardens in
do
Piccadilly Circus.
is exactly is move further south. So am I doomed?
Not necessarily doomed, but I would say one of the biggest findings after 20 years of this is that for most people, their environment drives their health more so than any individual responsibility. So where you live has a big impact. In the United States, for example, within the same cities, there are neighborhoods where the life expectancy is up to 13 years higher than other neighborhoods.
13 years high within the same
In the same city. Boston's one of them, by the way.
So it's a
where
great example.
Zoe has a.
Where I spent a lot of time in Boston, where the weather is
yeah.
also not so great.
Yeah, right.
But you're saying it's not just it's not really the latitude, it's like what your environment is like.
And my research work is finding these blue zones and understanding them. My daytime job is working with cities to transport the environmental characteristics that we see driving longevity in blue zones to American cities. And that's been fantastically successful for us.
And I know that one of the things you talk about, particularly within the blue zones, is this idea of a centenarian. Could you explain what a centenarian is? And maybe just could you paint a picture a bit of like how people are living in these blue zones, which is something you talk about really beautifully in the book and in the show.
A centenarian is simply a person that's reached their 100th birthday. And blue zones isn't necessarily about centenarians. We do measure centenarian concentration, but that tends to be a byproduct of a population that is producing long-lived people, largely without chronic disease, largely without diabetes, heart disease, types of cancer, dementia. They're not people with better bodies than us. They don't have a genetic advantage. They're not more disciplined. They're not smarter. They're avoiding the diseases that foreshorten their lives in higher percentages, and that's why they're living a long time. I mean, I wrote 4 books, New York Times bestselling books on this topic, but in general, people in blue zones don't exercise, which is disruptive to a lot of us.
That is very surprising to hear.
You don't see anybody doing CrossFit or Pilates or an elliptical in their basement, but they do live in places where every time they go to work or a friend's house or out to eat, it occasions a walk. They always have gardens out back, and typically 2 or 3 growing seasons a year. Their houses aren't full of the mechanized conveniences to do their work for them. They're doing their own housework and their own yard work and kneading bread by hand. So my team figures that they're moving every 20 minutes or so, but unconsciously, probably keeping their metabolisms burning higher and probably burning more calories than somebody who works at their desk all day long and then thinks they're going to the gym at the end of the day. First of all, most people don't go to the gym at the end of the day as they think they're going to do. But secondly, it's not as good as spreading out the physical activity throughout the day. If you want to know what a 100-year-old ate to live to be 100, you can't just go ask them because the people don't remember. So to get at that, we found dietary surveys done in all 5 blue zones over the last 100 years or so. 155 dietary surveys. And Tim, as you know, dietary surveys aren't perfect, but they're directionally correct. And when you analyze them, you start to get a very clear signal, or you see the same patterns. So we did that, and what people who make it up to 100, on average, they're eating about 90% whole food plant-based. The 5 pillars of every longevity diet in the world are whole grains, wheat, corn, and rice, greens, and of course, garden vegetables, the olive garden vegetables, tubers. Interestingly, in Okinawa, about 70% of their caloric intake until 1970 came from one tuber known as emo, or the purple sweet potato, nuts, and the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world is beans. And if you're eating a cup of beans a day, it's probably associated with about 4 extra years of life expectancy over less healthy sources of protein. The other facets sort of fall into 2 categories. One is living your life on purpose, which seems soft and spongy to real scientists, but there's a pretty clear evidence that if you wake up in the morning with meaning, you're living about 8 years longer than people who are rudderless in life. And really the foundation of blue zones is their social connectedness. They tend to prioritize family. They tend to belong to a faith, believe it or not. And they're very careful about their immediate social circle. And you don't hear much about these things because marketers can't sell you anything. But really how you connect drives your behavior for the long run in powerful and measurable ways. And we like to talk a lot about how we connect in the blue zones.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think this being like Zoe Science and Nutrition, I feel like food is probably the place to start. And I definitely want to pull Tim in as well as we talk a bit more about what you've found out, like looking at the diets of what people are eating across these areas. And, the first thing I'm struck is like, I've been to Italy quite often. I've been to Japan once or twice. And it strikes me that those diets seem like almost as far apart as I can imagine. But what's interesting is you're talking about actually how there's sort of commonality across these blue zones. So, like, what am I missing, I guess, that actually is linking them more closely than I had realized?
In general, we're constantly marketed these superfoods. Whenever I see a superfood, I basically just mentally throw it in the trash bin. Usually when there's a health claim on the package, you can be pretty sure it's not healthy. And real foods for longevity tend to be peasant foods. The cheap stuff everybody can afford. In America, we hear all the time, you need fresh fruits and vegetables. That's the wrong way to start, especially in the inner city when there are poor people, for 2 reasons. One, people can't afford it, and it creates an immediate barrier. And number 2, people don't know what to do with it. But you give African Americans or Latin Americans or the Italians beans and a grain, they know exactly what to do with it. Africans, the beans and rice. The Latin Americans, beans and corn tortilla. The Italians, pasta fagioli, pasta and beans. And you have a complex carbohydrates, fiber, you have all the amino acids necessary for human sustenance. So the big common denominator is peasants' food made to taste delicious. And that last part, that's the most important ingredient. Taste is the most important ingredient. And these blue zones, they know how to make this very simple food absolutely sing.
Plus a bit of diversity, I think, as well. I mean, when I've gone to visit Japan and Italy and Mediterranean countries, you do see some similarities, actually. I mean, their noodles are the equivalent of spaghetti, but it's what else they put on the noodles. It's the fact that they have all these different specialty restaurants in Japan that will, use all kinds of different ingredients and, hundreds of different kinds of mushrooms and onions and all these beans and bean sprouts and all these little pickles and fermented foods. And the equivalent, so people think of Japan as just sushi and rice. It's not. When you actually go there, it's very, very different to the sort of the westernized version of what Japanese food is. And it varies a lot between the islands and regions, just like it does in Italy. And so I think, for me, it's that diversity of the foods, the fact that there's great food culture, so people will make all this stuff in their homes that may have had peasant origins, but is still carrying on, and they'll mix stuff together in rich soups and casseroles all the time. And they're having fermented foods as well. I think that's the other thing that we don't really discuss enough is that, in the Mediterranean countries, lots of goat's cheese and yogurts and other dairy ferments. And in Japan, of course, you've got all the misos and the fermented soy products that are eaten regularly. So you've got this diversity and the fermented foods and this food culture that is all about, passing on what your grandmother taught you to the next generation. I think they're also very binding things that identify these very healthy groups.
Hi. I hope you're feeling inspired by the lessons we're learning from how these centenarians have lived their lives. Now, I'd like to ask you a favor in return. It turns out that 63% of people who watch this podcast haven't hit the subscribe button, and 11% haven't yet hit the bell to turn notifications on. So if you've ever enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button and turn notifications on. Doing us this small favor will really help us to reach more people with life-changing health information. Thank you, and on with the show.
And Tim, I heard Dan mention like whole grains, like greens, tubers, nuts, beans. What are your thoughts as Dan saying, this is like what I've pulled across from observing across those these blue zones? Like, what does the latest science tell us about those foods? And
well, tell us that Dan's exactly right. Those foods are
good one, Dan. That's good.
and up to recently, we didn't know why they were good. Really, we because we've had this rather reductionist view of foods that
reductionist
meaning that we take the hundreds of chemicals in any one food and we talk about one of them. So it might be carotene in carrots, or it might be vitamin C in a lemon, and we ignore all the 800 others there. And this is where we've thought about what's good about beans, and we just thought about one thing in beans. It turns out it's the entirety, it's that diversity, not only of the food, but the chemicals within each food and the different fibers there might be there.
And there's a lot of fiber in the foods that Dan was talking about? Is that the thing that really carries them together?
Yeah, it's really a combination of high fiber foods which feed our microbes, but also polyphenols, which are these chemicals within them that used to be called antioxidants that are also fuel for our gut microbes. And these polyphenols have lots of properties on their own as health-giving properties, but I think their main action is by improving our gut health. And that's how we get all these universal effects. And I'd imagine my research on aging really has sort of pointed to the immune system being pretty critical here. Because if you can have a healthy immune system, then that immune system is repairing your body continuously. It's fighting early cancer. It's repairing the cells. It's making sure that you do live to an old age by picking up problems early. And if that's in perfect condition and it's not fighting inflammation, it's not not dealing with obesity, it's really focused on its main job. That is how most of us who do succeed to live a long time are going to do it. So foods that are good for your gut are going to be good for your immune system, and everything we've talked about, it's whole foods, and they're not poisoning their system with ultra-processed foods as well. And I think it's interesting, Dan was telling me that some of these places have lost their veneer that they had, because
meaning
that the places like Okinawa have now been exposed to ultra-processed food, and they're not doing as well as
their diet has changed, Junior. Is that what you're saying, Dan?
So their diet has moved from this sort of 100% whole food diets to increasing percentage of ultra-processed foods with chemicals and lower fiber intake, and starting to see an effect on this.
And just to make sure that that I'd understood this right, I think what you're saying is if you look across the sort of set of foods that Dan was talking about, what you really see is foods that not only have all these polyphenols, which are all of these sort of magic complex chemicals, but they have a lot of fiber, and that critically what you're saying is fiber isn't one thing, which I think is how I always thought about it, and I suspect most listeners think about it, right? You see it on the back of the packet and it says fiber. Actually, I think you're saying there's like 1,000 different sorts of fiber, and that we think that the individual bacteria in our gut actually eat specific fibers. So it's almost like,
Yeah.
and that, is that right?
They're very picky. Yeah, they're very specialized and very picky. So that's why the diversity of foods, whether it's even different beans, different colored beans, is going to produce a different set of gut microbes inside you that are going to produce different chemicals that might enhance your immune system even more and help you live longer.
But I will say just a couple of refinements on what you said about the blue zones. The blue zones are actually subsets of the countries we're talking about. Like Sardinia, the blue zone in Sardinia is very different than Italy. The blue zone in Sardinia is actually only 6 villages, and they're descendant from a Bronze Age culture. They're matriarchal, like the rest of the Mediterranean's patriarchal, and they have a quite different diet. Same thing with Okinawa. Until 1917, Okinawa wasn't even part of Japan. It was called the Ryukyu's Kingdom, and their diet is completely different. We tend to think of Japanese as fish heavy, but the Okinawans didn't eat very much fish at all. They tended to eat this emo, as I mentioned, tons of tofu, and basically what grew in their garden. And both of these blue zones did not have huge access to a tradition where there was a vast variety of food. They were poor, and they tended to have to eat what was available, what was growing that season. Of course, there were herbs and there were spices. Often they had a kitchen garden. But if you look at the patterns, typically they only had 20 or 30 ingredients at any given time that sort of rolled with the season. So as you went from summer garden to winter garden, those ingredients. But I think it makes it actually less discouraging for people because you don't have to think about having 100 ingredients. These people stayed very healthy for a long time.
And Dan, I was just thinking, like, people are quite familiar with Italian food. There'll be a lot more people who say, I don't really know Japanese at all. Could you elaborate a little bit, I guess, on the difference between what these people in these 5 villages in Sardinia are eating versus maybe sort of our traditional idea of what Italian food is? Because I think most of us are like, oh, I eat nothing but Italian food, pizza and pasta. So if that's the secret to my long and healthy life, I'm feeling really good about it.
Yeah, so the diet of longevity in Sardinia is more a verb than a noun because there were at least 3 phases.
Okay.
Until about 1960, believe it or not, most of what they ate was bread and cheese. These shepherds had several different kinds of bread, sourdough usually, but also a flatbread called carta di musica. They were shepherds, so these men would go into their pastures.
And olive oil, though, wouldn't they?
Olive oil, but not as much as you think. The highlands of Sardinia, the terrain is very rugged and not conducive to the olive groves like you would see. Actually, more mastic oil, believe it or not, in the 40s and 50s. But to your point, olive oil is now ubiquitous in Sardinia. In about 1960s, roads came in. And remember, centenarians were alive. They were middle-aged in 1960s.
Amazing.
Their diet shift. They were still poor people, and they relied very heavily on huge gardens. And pasta started to come in. But there's more gnocchi than there is pasta. A lot of dishes made with fava beans. And, of course, their celebratory food was pork. Never beef, very little chicken. But on average, about 5 times a month, they would eat pork, the family pig.
5 times a month. So this is a very, very low level of meat eating you're describing.
Very low level. The average
and
American...
I guess if they're in the mountains, they're not eating a lot of fish either?
No. In fact, you can see the ocean from the blue zone of Sardinia. But I met several centenarians that first time they ate fish in their life when they're in their 20s.
Okay.
And that's because it took a day to get to the sea. They didn't have a fishing culture, but maybe they get some fish. But by the time they got it back up to their village, it stunk. So you'd see this sort of dried cod once in a while, bacalao, they called it, and they reconstitute that. But it wasn't. We tend to think fish is associated with longevity, but not a lot of fish in the blue zones.
I think a lot of people will be surprised by that because there's such a lot of talk about protein today and this idea that we're all short of protein. And you can find, if you walk into the grocery store, right, an enormous number of things saying high in protein, which suggests, oh my God, marketing. I'm like low on protein.
Yeah, but you probably know this, but a CDC, Center for Disease Controls in America, So they tell us that the average American gets about twice the amount of protein they need. So we're getting way more protein than we need. And
when you
I
look
think
at these
people don't
blows,
realize that you can get all the protein you need out of plant-based sources. So you don't need meat to be healthy. Meat tastes good, but
and this low level of eating like meat and fish, is that common across the blue zones?
yes, all blue zones. There's a subset of Adventists who eat no meat at all. The highest meat consumption in the blue zones, I would say, is in Costa Rica. And it's not that they don't like it. It's not that they're, more virtuous and they care about the environment, or they care about animal suffering. They just couldn't afford it. And as soon as you were beginning to mention, as soon as roads come in and they start adopting a more Western or American way of life, their meat consumption has skyrocketed, their processed food consumption has skyrocketed. At the same time, diabetes has skyrocketed, heart disease. And in one of the blue zones, Okinawa, it produced the longest lived, healthiest people in the history of the world. And now they're the least healthy prefecture in all of Japan, largely because of the fast food restaurants,
and this
thanks
is
to the
within
American
the
film.
period, basically, that
Since I started
you've
studying them in 20 years.
That's
they've gone from
incredibly
the longest lived
sad.
people on the planet to the least healthy people in Japan, largely because of the American food culture. I'm very sorry.
And of course, as soon as you start getting cheap meat on the plate, it's not so much the effect of that meat, but the fact it displaces all those healthy beans and other vegetables that they were eating before. So I think people have got this idea about a dichotomous view of meat as it's either healthy or unhealthy, rather than the fact that, okay, if we take away ultra-processed meats, which are nearly everyone agrees are unhealthy, natural, well-cooked meat is fine, but it displaces, there's just no room on your plate. If you're having meat every day, you can't have the same level of other vegetables, legumes, etc., that kept these populations so healthy. So this is, I think, one reason. And also we talk about this a lot in nutrition. Sarah always talk about it. It's instead of what. We take it, it's not just one thing it has to be in context. So as you said, Okinawa, they've displaced a lot of the good stuff with the bad stuff. And so some of it is the bad stuff coming in, but a lot of it is they're no longer having the good stuff because there's, their minds and plates are full of other stuff.
One of your other guests, Walter Willett, famously said about meat, it's a lot like radiation. We know a lot will kill you, but we don't quite know the safe level. And if you look at blue zones, the suggestion of 5 times per month seems to be associated, or it doesn't seem to be getting in the way of them living long, largely chronic disease-free lives.
And it's interesting about the fish also, because I think most people listening to this there will be some exceptions. A lot of people are like, yeah, okay, I sort of know that red meat's not good for me, but a lot of people, and I think Sarah might be here also talking about the positive benefits of fish. So it's quite interesting that is not something that
saying it's not good for
I know
you.
you're not saying it, but you're not saying it's interesting that hasn't been an essential component to be a blue zone, because I might have expected that to have been like, they will definitely be eating quite a lot of fish in their diet as a complement. So, maybe not a huge total amount of calories, but that was a really important nutrient. But it sounds like you're saying that actually fish eating is not essential to being one of these blue zones and being
that's
a
right, for
Centenarian.
sure it's not. But you have to realize, as I said before, the diet's a verb. It's changed dramatically, especially in the last 20 years. And they're almost caught up with the rest of Italy in the case of Sardinia, or exceeded Japan in the case of Okinawa at embracing this ultra-processed, meat-heavy diet.
So you're basically telling a story that the blue zones are disappearing.
They're going to hell.
Is that really the sort of...
Well,
which is quite sad, because we're all reading everything about how our climate is being destroyed and the world is falling apart, and you have been seeing almost in your own lifetime quite sort of the way in which these patterns that were so healthy are falling away.
That's right. But yes, and
it's
even
hard
though,
to be isolated, though, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
that's the other thing, is you get contaminated by cultures and pressures and marketing that's global, and so it's very hard for these, say, mountain villages, around the world to stay isolated in their bubble. And I think that's the other thing we're seeing. It's like, It used to only be, if you had to live on the coast to eat fish. Now it's frozen and, everyone can get it in their freezer.
I guess the other thing that's really interesting is it tells you that this is a bit by chance, is what you're saying. It's not like these people in these zones were like, this is my absolute favorite food and I'm choosing to eat it because it's my favorite food and it's making me healthy. Actually, it was sort of, they were quite poor. This was like what was available and that they could support where they are. And then when we've suddenly been offered all of this meat and candy and all the rest of it, you're saying they weren't like, I don't want any of that. Actually, they're like, oh, okay, that sounds tasty. And unexpectedly, this is then affecting their health. Is that the
Well, there's
story of
a
what's going on,
generational
or?
shift. The diets of the blue zones, I wrote about them in the Blue Zone Kitchen. There's a lot of ingenuity and intentionality in creating these recipes. It's usually the women who maintain the food tradition. And they are genius at taking these very simple, inexpensive peasant foods and making them taste delicious. And they have a taste for them. So the cohort of people over 60 in Okinawa, for example, still have the highest concentration of centenarians in the world. It's the 20-year-olds who started eating the burgers and the Kentucky Fried Chicken, and their taste buds have been napalmed, and they're now used for the richer, fattier, enhanced flavored
You
foods.
immediately play straight into my guilt as a parent about the fact that I'm not bringing my children up well enough to appreciate the sort of food that I know is good for their health. They were exposed to all of this very easy to eat food, which tastes really sugary fast and lots of meat and all the rest of it. And if you get that you're saying, I think that because they've been exposed to that early, it's like, well, that's delicious. And this is, of course, what I would choose over this other food, which is also probably harder to prepare. Being a parent is really hard, particularly I think being a mother in most cases is still today primary care. But it's really hard to juggle all of this. So I think that in the reality of the food that's around and available, I think there's enough guilt around parenting. So I think that is a bit the reality of the environment we're in. And the question is, how can we make it easier? And so I think it is hard, right? This is what we're...
Yeah, I agree. It's a lack of education. It's not, I don't think it's anyone's fault. They're told your kid will only have processed apple puree from a little can that's got a baby picture on it, realizing actually they can pretty much eat anything. And in that 2-year window, they are really inquisitive and they will eat all kinds of stuff that they won't eat when they're 3. And so you have that very narrow time to really expand their and no one is telling parents this.
We spent a lot of time talking about food. I would love to pick up on a couple of other areas, Dan, before we talk about what listeners could actually do. And I thought one of the things that was really interesting, actually, that I had never thought about to do with this Blue Zones was stress. And I guess the obvious starting point, I think, is many people listening will assume that these centenarians have lived a life without any stress, and that is why they've lived so long. Is that correct?
People in the blue zones are exactly like us. They could be one of the 3 of us sitting here or anybody listening right now. They worry about their health. They worry about their kids. They worry about their work. They get stressed in their lives. They have a couple things that we don't have or have forgotten. Number one, they have these sacred daily rituals that help release or tamp down the stress of everyday life. The Okinawans have this ancestor veneration. In their homes, there's always a shrine of remembrances of their parents and their grandparents and their great-great-grandparents. And they'll always begin their day with 15 minutes remembering where they came from, and to a certain extent, being able to relinquish their day up to these ancestors who they believe are still looking over that. In fact, you often see up along the ceiling, angled down at you, the portraits of all their ancestors sort of looking down at you. And I think that helps. The Adventists are big prayers. They wake up in the morning and they relinquish their day to their God. They say a prayer before a meal, so they kind of slow down and probably lower the cortisol level of that meal. The Costa Ricans and the Icarians are big nappers. Believe it or not, taking a nap is a great way to lower cortisol levels, lower stress. The other big point, they live in environments that lower stress. One of the easiest ways to lower stress is to go out with your friends, to not be alone with your problems and stew on them. So every time they walk out their door, they're bumping into their friends. They tend to live in extended families. So there tends to often be a grandparent who has 8 or 9 or 10 decades of accumulated wisdom and resiliency that he or she can transmit to a grandchild who's having a tough time. They tend to be close to nature. They walk out their door and down the street, and they look at the sea, or they're in the forest. So much about lowering stress is the environment they live in. But I absolutely agree that stress is a very important component to manage if you want to live longer.
A lot of these groups have communal eating and drinking, don't they? So I've often thought that when I go into Mediterranean countries, the fact that people are having a drink, you see old folk, gathering every evening to have a glass of wine together. And they just have one glass of wine that lasts them 2 hours.
Yeah.
I've often thought that some of the advantages of, say, red wine might be the fact that actually it's doing something social. And it might be the same if it was kombucha or a non-alcoholic drink, but it got them out. It was a reason for people to bond. And I think societies, that are sort of anti-alcohol or who don't have that similar bond, which is a sort of cultural one as much as anything. It's not like they're all alcoholics. It's just a cultural mix, does allow them to communicate and relieve stress and talk to others. And I think they're all sort of interlinked. So it's quite interesting how, the idea of the aperitif hour.
It's like you were saying about nutrients. You can't really pull the nutrient out and draw a conclusion. It's the package. Yeah. And you can pan out even further of the package that comes with eating a meal or the package with drinking a glass of wine.
And the fact that these people are spending 2 or 3 times longer than the average American on a meal. I mean, I think, the importance of that ticks all the boxes from digestion to communication to de-stressing, to making these other contacts. So just the act of a communal meal sort of ticks all these boxes that we now know are really important for longevity.
And is there real science behind this idea that stress can reduce your life expectancy, or that being able to relieve your stress can affect this? Because, I think people talk about it, but is there reality behind that?
Let's take a quick break. I want to tell you about something new we've made for you, a free guide that will kickstart your journey to better gut health. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you're no doubt already aware of how important the gut microbiome is. It impacts our digestion, it helps support our immune system, and it even impacts our mental well-being. Now, as we've heard many times on this show, and as our members know through using Zoe, we feed our gut microbiome through the variety of foods we eat. And in return, our microbes give us this wealth of health benefits. So how can you nurture your gut in the best way? Which food swaps can you try to feed those good bacteria? What does a high-fiber shopping list look like? Well, our free gut health guide will tell you all of that and more. It's jam-packed with actionable tips designed to put you in control of your gut health. To get yours for free, simply go to zoe.com/gutguide.
Well, there's certainly lots of animal data to suggest that's true, that stress increases inflammation levels. So, mental stress has physical effects on the body, which it will make those animals die earlier. That's certainly true. It's hard to do those same experiments in humans. Obviously, no one wants to be particularly stressed.
There's one study.
There are correlations.
Done among caretakers, people taking care of someone with a disease, and they measure telomeres. The longer your telomeres, the younger you are biologically. And they followed with control group.
And telomeres are just the ends of chromosomes that are like there's a plastic bit on a shoelace that over time erodes and is a way of estimating your lifespan in a way.
Right. And you want long telomeres. So a control group who just lived a normal life, and then caretakers of sick people, presumably under a lot of stress. over 5 years, they had shorter telomeres than people who didn't have the stress. So there's pretty good
And
evidence.
there is some epidemiological evidence when they followed up. There's a whole study back a few decades ago of civil servants, and they had all the civil servants records
In the UK,
in the UK when they'd worked out when they died, and they adjusted for all factors like weight and social class and education. And one of the big factors determining when they liked to die was what they call the locus of control. How many people were their boss? And if you were at the bottom of that food chain,
Right.
the idea was that person had very little idea they were in control of their life, whereas the people at the top of the food chain did feel at top of it, and they would live twice as long as the people on the bottom when you adjusted for all these other factors. And they've done similar studies in, I think it's gorillas and various other primates. So the amount of stress you perceive is definitely linked to longevity.
And so as you're listening to Dan talking about like these ways that could de-stress, like that sounds a plausible element.
Yeah, because you may not be able to change your position in a company or a job or a family, but if the way you react to it can be dissipated, then this is how you need to do it. And if you're in that sort of community, you're much less likely to feel those effects than if you're perhaps on your own or in a sort of northern or sort of Western type community where everyone fends for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you haven't touched on it, but sitting here in a northern climate in November, I'm also thinking that the sun is shining quite a lot in these environments as you talk about it as well, and
Yes.
therefore your ability to like be outside and sort of take pleasure is presumably quite high. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we don't know if it's sun exposure. It might be in the vitamin D that comes from sun exposure, or you're more likely to be physically active, or you're more likely to have a garden.
Or meet your friends.
Or be, yeah.
I mean,
it's-
that's the
it's-
other. They're all
When
linked.
it's
That's the
pouring
problem.
rain, you don't want to go outdoors. But, I'll add to that sort of stress conversation. In blue zones, people tend to have a vocabulary for purpose. Plan de vida in Costa Rica, or ikigai in Okinawa. People tend to have a very clear idea of why they wake up in the morning. And I believe that's also a big stress shedder. Because for people who wake up and, what's my place in life? What should I do today? You get this sort of existential stress. The unemployed, I think, have it as well. Whereas people in blue zones don't have that. They know they have a responsibility to their family or to their communities. And ask the average American what their sense of purpose is. They don't, I gotta go to work. But in Okinawa, you ask people their ikigai, they can, off the top of their head, they'll know why they're waking up in the morning, their purpose. And I think that also relieves a lot of stress of the human condition.
That's amazing. I'd like to touch quickly on something that we mentioned right at the beginning, which is physical activity, before talking about what someone listening might do. And I just want to pick up on something you said earlier, which is sort of none of these people are doing exercise. What are they doing?
They're moving naturally throughout their day. They're moving all day long, but unconsciously. I know this exercise is popular and it's sort of been a public health intervention, but I have to say in America, it's been a miserable failure. In the United States, fewer than 24% of people even get 20 minutes of physical activity a day. So we spend $150 billion a year on the exercise industry, and people don't go. Yet in blue zones, they're moving all the time, but they spend zero money on it. And my argument is, instead of trying to hound people to get up and go to the gym or, pay for this gold level membership, design our streets so it's easy, safe, and aesthetically pleasing to walk to get our coffee, to walk to work, for our kids to walk to school, which we don't do anymore. When I was a kid, 50% of American kids walked to school. We're down to 10%.
50% down to 10%.
Yeah, in the United States. So we've
amazing.
engineered that physical activity out of our lives. And for most people, simply walking 45 minutes a day is about 90% the value of training for a marathon. And is exercise a good idea? Yes. But does it work on the population level? No. I mean, if I were investing, if I were a government investing in an intervention, I would not invest in exercise. I would invest in walkable streets, parks, meeting places, aesthetically pleasing outdoors. We know that works.
I think it's incredibly powerful and it's interesting. I think that I now work from home. It's worked incredibly well for the company, but it took me a while to realize that basically my level of movement had collapsed, because before I used to commute, and I was living in London, which, like, New York or Boston or something has quite good public transportation. So I would walk to then go and take a underground train and then walk again at the other end. And then at lunch you would go out and you'd walk somewhere to get some food. And what I realized is, I was regularly doing 10,000 steps a day before that without really having to think about it. This is just what would happen. And then I was suddenly realized I'm doing 3,000 steps. I now am trying to engineer walking into my day. So, for example, I like to walk my daughter to school, because actually that just creates, in a really nice way, sort of 45 minutes of walking. And similarly, I really try and make sure I have some reason I have to be out of the house, and I have to proactively create that, though, Dan. And I'm just thinking a little bit about your example of these people living on their hill villages, right, where they're presumably having to go up and down the steps quite a lot just to to do anything.
What's happening in America, there's a sort of centrifugal development where the cities are dying and people are moving out into the suburbs. So imagine you start working at home and you live in a typical middle American suburb. There's nothing to walk to. Your garage is attached to your house, so you don't even walk to your car. So you walk out your door, you get in your car, you drive to the mall, or you go to a drive-through Starbucks and pick up your coffee. There's almost no opportunity to unconsciously move. Until we look at the elephant in the room, that you cannot keep flogging the dead horse of individual responsibility if you want to get populations healthier. You have to set up their environment so you set them up for success. You have to create cities where it's easy for people to move naturally, and we're doing the opposite.
And Dan, you are pushing on this yourself, right? This
That's
has sort of
my
become
business.
your passion as well as your business, is to try and get cities to redesign themselves.
Because it works.
So if you're listening to this and you're in charge of a city, then you should be following up with Dan. If you're listening to this and you're not in charge of a city, but you want to understand what's the actionable advice, or how can I do this for myself? How could you make your life more blue zone
without having to move to a mountainous area?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, okay, the first thing is to shift away from the silver bullet mentality, which most of us have, to what I call a silver buckshot mentality. Silver buck means sort of a scatter pattern of little BBs instead of, it's a little self-serving, but I wrote a book called The Blue Zone Challenge, where I aggregated about 40 or so evidence-based ways for you to set up your kitchen, your bedroom, and your home, so you mindlessly move more, eat less and eat better, and socialize more. And they tend to do, like in your kitchen, I'm a big believer that we're all on a seafood diet. We eat the food we see. So if on your counter, America, we start eating a bag of chips, and we don't finish it, we put a clip on it, we put it on the counter. Bad idea. Instead, if you put a bowl, you go out and buy yourself the most beautiful fruit bowl you can afford, and put that in the middle and keep that full. So when you walk through the kitchen, the default is fruit rather than the chips. There's actually been Cornell Food Lab did a study on toasters. Very little of what we put in toasters produces something healthy on the back end. So taking the toaster off the counter occasions people losing about 2 kilos after 2 years, as opposed to those who don't. People who have plants throughout their homes actually move more because they're watering plants. There's little things you can do to nudge yourself into moving more. And I'm a much bigger believer in setting up your home, your commute, your social life. If your 3 best friends are obese and unhealthy, there's a 150% better chance that you'll be unhealthy yourself. So in other words, if your 3 best friends sit around and eat wieners and chips and watch TV, guess what you're going to be doing when you hang out with them? As opposed to friends whose idea of recreation is biking or walking or playing tennis. And it's not a bad idea to have friends like Tim, who, love plant-based food. We think it's so hard for middle-aged people, but I argue the number one thing you could do to add years to your life is re-curate your immediate social circle. Those 3 friends who you count on when you're having a bad day, or with people with whom you can have a meaningful conversation. Those people are going to have a measurable and long-term impact on how active you are, on what you eat. And it's a counterintuitive. Nobody can make any money off of you, but being very careful about who you let in the room.
What do your studies tell us about gardening? Because there's some evidence that gardeners, well, epidemiologically are healthier and have healthier microbiomes. Do the blue zones tell you anything about how that might help them, or is it very variable?
I don't know why, but I can tell you in every blue zone, almost everybody who are making it into their 90s and 100s not only garden their whole life, but continue to do so. And it might be because it's low intensity physical activity. It's a nudge. When you have a garden and you've planted something you can't wait to eat, it gives you an incentive to go out every day and weed and water and harvest. And, they're bending over. It's a range of motion. I've seen the studies that show that when you're gardening, your cortisol levels or your stress hormones drop. And it could very well be you get your hands dirty and you wipe your mouth and you're getting the microbiomes. There's a little bit of dirt. But I argue that gardening is probably much better than joining any gym, the best longevity exercise you could do.
That's fascinating. The one thing I guess we haven't touched on so much is around the stress reduction. So you talked about these rituals in these blue zones, but those are rituals that sound very rooted in the culture they're in. So if someone's listening and saying, I really like that idea, what are the rituals that I guess, that you do, for example?
First of all, take your TV or your computer screen out of your kitchen. I think you'll eat more intentionally with less stress if you do that. Eat together as a family, as opposed to with one hand on your steering wheel. Take a nap, a known stress reducer. Belong to a faith. I'm not a hugely religious person, but people who have a Sabbath, Jewish people or the Adventists, this idea of a sanctuary in time where 24 hours a day, they're putting their work aside and they're putting their busy social calendar aside and focusing on their God or focusing on their internal life. Hanging out with low stress friends. These are all sort of ecosystem changes we can make to our lives, that as opposed to remember to meditate, which I believe in. I'm a meditator, but I forget about it all the time.
So the benefit of your friends is it just makes it natural and it just happens, versus something like a meditation, which is a bit like going to the gym. It requires you to sort of
like remembering
to do something. Yeah. Is that the difference that you're describing? So it's not that you're against it, but the point is it's a lot easier if it's just built into your social fabric.
That's right. That's the approach. Because if you look at any sort of intentional behavior, health behavior, whether it's exercise, getting on a diet, taking supplements, there's a recidivism curve. They all last months pretty well, and only a few amount of months, 3 to 7 months, but then it drops off precipitously. I challenge anybody to tell me about one diet in the history of the world that's worked for more than 4% of the people who get on it after 2 years. So it's a great business plan, great marketing vehicle. You get people on it every year. But it's a bad longevity strategy, because when it comes to longevity, mark my words, other than not dying, there's nothing you can do this month that's going to make you live longer in 30 years. You have to think about things that you're going to do most days for the next few decades if you really want it to work for longevity.
One last question. We talk a lot with Tim about what he eats on a regular basis. And I know that lots of listeners are going to be really curious about what your daily diet is. Could you share what you typically eat in a day?
So I found the minestrone that the longest lived family in the history of the world eats. It's the Malese family in Sardinia. 9 siblings, collective age, 860 years. They make the same minestrone every day. And it's 3 beans with all kinds of vegetables, carrots, celery, onions, some oregano, some red pepper, some potatoes, or else maybe some barley, finish with an extra virgin olive oil. I make a huge pot of that every week. Then I store it in glass Tupperwares, glass containers I can freeze. And then every morning, it's more like a brunch. I usually eat about 11 o'clock, and that's how I start my day. So in the Tim Spector way of thinking, I have this cocktail of all these fibers. Because it's got a grain and beans, I get my protein in there, all kinds of trace minerals, and I feel like I get a good base for my day.
That's amazing. Can we get the recipe?
You can get the recipe, yes.
Okay, we will follow up on the recipe,
I will give you
and
the
we
Blue
will.
Zone longevity cocktail.
We'll call it
love
the Dan Buettner Minestrone, and we will definitely share it, because I'm actually just my mouth is actually salivating. Never mind the longevity. I would like to try and do what we always do, which is a quick summary. And Dan and Tim, will you just correct me if I get any of this wrong? So we start off by explaining what blue zones were, which are these like particular places where people have aged healthily much more than anywhere else. And they're very small places. So it's not like Japan or Italy. It's like these very particular sort of villages where, interestingly, what really distinguishes them, I think, is that they're not getting sick through middle age and later, and therefore they're ending up very old and healthy. And so levels of dementia and cardiovascular disease and all of these things are really low. That there's a lot that's just built into the environment that is achieving this. There are no silver bullets, to use Dan's phrase. But some of the things that are in common is the sort of foods they're eating, the fact that they're having to move constantly. So no one is going to the gym, but they are effectively doing exercise by just what happens in their life. They all live in places where the weather is quite good, but not right in the tropics where they're going to get sort of infectious diseases. And then I think we talked about three particular aspects, and I know that there's more in the book and the show you talk about. We obviously talked a lot about diet. And interestingly, although they are eating very different foods, there's some real similarities. And you mentioned whole grains, you mentioned greens, tubers, nuts, and beans. And then Tim was basically saying, well, I'm not at all surprised about that, because actually what you see in common with those foods is two really important things. Lots and lots of fiber, and not just one type of fiber, but all of these diverse types of fibers and lots of these polyphenols. And so Tim is saying, well, that is what feeds their microbiome, supports all of these different bacteria that then creates all of these things that support the immune system. And your research, Tim, I think, is saying that like this healthy immune system seems to be really crucial for fighting aging in the long term. You then shared this rather sad fact that I had not really fully understood, that these blue zones are sort of dying. I guess they're becoming red zones, Dan, and gave Okinawa as this example where even just in 20 years, you've seen that as the diet has shifted dramatically, you see that suddenly they go from being some of the healthiest to the least healthy. So you see just how important the diet is in this. Then you talked a little bit about things that people could do about diet. And I thought one of them, which I'd never heard before, is redesign your kitchen. So how do you have like all this beautiful healthy food on display, like fruit? I was immediately thinking you could have the nut bowl there, but remove the toaster, which is, I think, really interesting way to redesign. And then you said you have the magic minestrone, so there are no silver bullets, but everybody listening to this now wants that minestrone recipe. We will follow up. So if you're signed up for a Zoe email, we will make sure that we share the minestrone recipe. Then we talked a bit about stress, and you said one of the things that's really interesting is there are sort of daily rituals that everybody has across these different blue zones. And so they were very different in different areas, but all of them are somehow very mindful. And whether it was like a prayer or like having a nap at a particular time or, happy hour, it created this. And that in almost all of this case, there's very close community. So this is like with not just your immediate family, but sort of extended family. And therefore, if you want to think about how you can do that at home, get rid of the things that get in the way. So, take the TV out of your kitchen, eat as a family. If you can, then actually belonging to a faith is really powerful because it's creating this sort of sanctuary, is your word, which I loved. And the thing that you said that really stuck with me is like go out with your friends, but recurate your three best friends. So if your three best friends are not supporting all of this, who is the other friend that maybe you could be spending more time with, who, like Tim, is going to pull you into eating, the better food, is going to take you out and do something physical? And I guess that brings us to the last point about exercise. these people are all moving all the time, but you basically think this whole push to go to the gym has failed, right? We've been saying this in the West, whether it's the States or the UK or anywhere, for decades, but actually nobody is moving. So think about how you design your life to move. How do you design your kids' life so that they move? And I think the example that you both spoke about right at the end, which was really interesting, is can you have a garden? That actually, if you have a garden and you're doing something actively, that creates this movement and this outside. So again, rather than thinking about exercise as this little spot that you do a few times a week, how would you just get this movement that you're seeing in the blue zones throughout?
But first of all, the brilliant summation. I can't believe you gathered all that, remembered it all, and were able to so articulately repeat it. But just a couple refinements. First of all, exercise programs do work for some people. The very disciplined and people who can presence of mind, and there is a subset. I just say as a population intervention, it's not very good return on the investment we put at. And then the central idea I like people to take away is in blue zones, people don't pursue health or longevity. It ensues, and it ensues from the right environment. And what we ought to be thinking about is not so much New Year's starting a new diet, which we know is going to fail for almost everybody, almost all the time, but how can we set up our lives and our ecosystem so the right behavior is more unconscious? And therein lies the long-term possibilities for longevity.
I love that. And I think that, one of the stories I think that I've taken from the last, 18 months of doing this podcast is the way in which, as a society, we've sort of been sleepwalking into this really unhealthy place. And in fact, mostly that hasn't been some evil plan by, like the government or whatever. I mean, in fact, often it's come from really good things, right? Like new discoveries, like you can have a car or, antibiotics saving so many lives. But then it turns out that it's changed our lives and there've been these sort of unexpected negative impacts. And so somehow we need to design the world that we live in a way which is just better suited to our human bodies.
We spent most of human history uncomfortable and hungry. And quite right, we've innovated, recently, and we now, live in this environment of abundance and ease and a glut of food. And we have we're genetically hardwired to crave fat, crave sugar, crave salt, and take rest whenever we can. And that works really well in this environment of scarcity. But in our environment of overabundance, it's a big negative. We're not going to change our genes. We're not going to change our genetic predisposition anytime soon. So we need to re-engineer our environment so that we still have the acceptable level of comfort, but that the healthy choice is easier, cheaper, and more appealing than the unhealthy choice.
And I think if anyone is listening to this right now and would like to redesign their town or city, wherever it is in the world, let us know. We'll put you in touch with Dan, because that is sort of your life mission, isn't it? To try and to make that better.
And you're doing that in 70 cities, isn't that right?
72 American cities so far, yes.
That's
it's
amazing.
Worked.
Brilliant. Dan, Tim, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
Pleasure.
An honor.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on Zoe Science and Nutrition today. Today's conversation about the blue zones has once again highlighted the critical importance of diet in supporting us to live a long and healthy life. And the story of Okinawa is another depressing example of how rapidly a switch to a modern Western diet can damage our health. If you're interested in getting personalized advice on the right food to eat for your body to help you feel better now and enjoy many more healthy years to come, then you can learn more about becoming a Zoe member by going to zoe.com/podcast. You can also get 10% off your membership on this link. As always, I'm your host, Jonathan Wolf. Zoe Science and Nutrition is produced by Yella Hewins Martin, Richard Willen, and Tilly Fulford. See you next time.